The fog pressed against the windows of the little tailoring shop like a living thing, thick and gray and reaching. Mina Whitcomb set down her needle and pushed a loose strand of hair from her brow. Her fingers ached. Her back ached. Even her eyes ached from squinting at seams by candlelight for the better part of 10 hours. She glanced at the small tin box on the corner of her work table, then at the shelf where a single crust of bread sat wrapped in a scrap of muslin. That was supper. That was, if she was honest with herself, breakfast too. Mina rose from her stool with a soft groan and crossed the narrow room. The floorboards, warped from years of damp Cumberland winters, creaked beneath her worn leather boots. She lifted the tin, tipped it into her palm, and counted what fell out. 3 shillings, 2 pennies, a single farthing that had gone green with age. Not enough for the rent, not near enough. She set the coins back one by one, slow as a woman placing petals upon a grave. The wind outside picked up, rattling the shop sign that hung above her door. It was a crooked wooden thing, painted with the words, Whitcomb and Daughter, Tailoring, though there had been no father in the shop for 6 years now, and the paint had begun to peel at the edges. Mina hadn't the coin to have it redone, and she hadn't the heart to have the name changed. She moved to the small hearth and stirred the last of the coals. A thin curl of smoke rose and died. She would need to be sparing with the fire tonight. Coal was dear, and the merchant on the high street had grown impatient with her promises to settle her account come Friday. Mina reached for the crust of bread. She sat on the low stool by the hearth, unwrapped the muslin, and stared down at the small, uneven piece. It was 2 days old, hard at the edges, and yet it might have been a joint of roast lamb for how her stomach twisted at the sight of it. She raised it to her lips. Then came the knock. It was no polite knock. It was a heavy, uneven sound, like a body slumping against the door and a fist dragging down after it. Mina froze, with the bread halfway to her mouth. The knock came again, weaker this time, and she thought she heard a rasping breath just beyond the timber. The town of Wetherby-on-Ings did not receive kindly visitors after dark. Fog like this brought highwaymen down from the moors, and there had been talk in the market of a coachman found finished on the road to Kirkby only a fortnight before. Mina set the bread down. Her hand crept towards the poker beside the hearth. "Who's there?" she called, though her voice came out thinner than she meant. The reply was a low groan and another slow, sliding sound against the door. She could have shouted for the constable, she could have bolted the latch and pretended she had not heard a thing, but something in that sound, something small and wounded and past the point of pretending, would not let her sit still. Mina drew the bolt. The door swung inward under the weight of a man, and he half fell across her threshold before she could catch him. He was tall, taller than any man she had ever tended to, and heavy with the wet of the fog, and something darker along the shoulder of his coat. His face was the color of ash. A gash ran from his temple down into his collar, and his lips were split and shivering. "Beg your pardon?" he managed, before his knees gave under him. Mina caught what she could of him, staggered under the weight, and eased him down onto the floorboards. The cold from his greatcoat bled straight through her sleeves. She kicked the door shut with her heel and dropped the bolt back into place. The wind pushed at it, as though it had followed him inside and wanted the rest of him too. "Sir? Sir? Can you hear me?" His eyes opened, dark and slow. He wet his lips. "No brigand," he rasped. "Please, I never said you were—" Mina moved swiftly then. Weariness had a way of leaving a woman when there was work to be done. She took down a length of soft flannel from the pile she kept for winter linings, and she wrapped it about his shoulders. She fetched a folded quilt from behind her sewing chair and pushed it under his head. She stoked the last of her coals until a thin, honest flame woke up, and she drew him nearer to the warmth by the collar of his coat. He was murmuring something. She bent close. "Owe you a great deal, ma'am." "You owe me nothing yet," she said. "Only your name, when you can manage it." His head fell back against the quilt. His breath rattled. Mina straightened up and looked at him then. Truly looked. His greatcoat was a heavy, dark blue wool, well made, though the road had done its worst to it. His boots were riding boots, muddied past the knee. There was a fine linen shirt beneath the coat, and his hands, though caked with grime, were not the hands of a laborer. They were long-fingered and clean at the nails. A faint pale line ran round the smallest finger of his left hand, as though he had lately worn a ring there and taken it off in a hurry. She would puzzle over that later. For now, she went to the shelf, and she took down the bread. She stood a moment with it in her palm. She thought of the empty larder. She thought of the rent that was coming due. She thought of her mother, gone 8 winters now, who had a saying for every trouble that ever came through their door. A closed hand catches no blessings. Mina, girl. She broke the bread in 2. The larger piece she pressed gently into the stranger's hand, folding his cold fingers around it. The smaller piece she kept for herself, though her stomach growled in protest. "Eat what you can," she whispered. "Slow. There's water in the kettle when you're ready for it." His eyes had closed again, but his fingers tightened around the bread. A faint sound came from his throat, and it might have been a thank you, or it might have been something else entirely. Mina could not tell. She sat back on the stool by the hearth. The fire crackled. The fog pressed at the windows. Somewhere far off, a church bell rang the hour, and she counted it out of habit. 9 strokes. She looked at the man on her floor and wondered, in the small, tired part of her heart that was still capable of wondering anything at all, whom she had just let into her home. Morning came slow and gray through the shop windows. Mina had not truly slept. She had dozed once or twice on the stool, her chin dropping to her chest, only to jerk awake at every shift of the stranger's breath. He lay where she had left him, closer to the hearth now, wrapped in the quilt, and a length of unfinished waistcoat lining she had spread over his legs. His fever had risen in the small hours. She had known it by the flush that crept up his neck, and the way his lips moved without sound, forming words that belonged to some other place. Now, in the pale light of dawn, he was awake. His dark eyes tracked her as she rose and moved to the kettle. He said nothing at first, only watched, and there was a quiet steadiness in the watching that made her aware of every step she took. "You've a fever still," Mina said, keeping her back to him. "I've a poultice steeping, my mother's receipt. It will bring the heat down. You sat up with me." His voice was hoarse, but steadier than the night before. She turned. He had propped himself on one elbow, though the effort made a muscle jump in his jaw. "You'd not have lasted the night otherwise." "Even so." He paused. "Not many would have." Mina did not answer that. She poured hot water over a handful of yarrow and willow bark and set the bowl on a stool beside him. Then she fetched a clean square of linen and dipped it in the steam. "Lie back, sir." He obeyed her, which surprised her. He did not look like a man who obeyed anyone often. She pressed the warm cloth to the gash at his temple. He drew a sharp breath through his teeth, but did not pull away. Up close, in the daylight, she could see him properly. He was perhaps 35, with dark hair that had gone damp with sweat, and a face that might have been called handsome once, before the road had done its work on him. There was a small scar at the corner of his mouth, older than the fresh wound, and his brow had the settled crease of a man who thought too much and slept too little. "May I know your name, sir?" "Lucas." He offered nothing after it. No surname, no trade. Mina waited a moment, then let it pass. "Mina Whitcomb. This was my father's shop." "Was?" He passed. 6 winters gone. Lucas's eyes moved over the room then, taking in the neat stacks of folded wool, the half-finished frock coat on its dummy, the shelves of thread arranged by color. His gaze lingered on the small brass shears hung above the mantel, and something in his expression softened. "You keep it well, I keep it standing," she said. "That is different." He gave a faint, tired smile at that, and she found herself looking away. She turned to the greatcoat that lay heaped by the door where she had dragged it the night before. The gash in the shoulder was long and clean, made by a blade rather than a fall. The wool was of a weight and weave she had rarely seen outside a gentleman's outfitter in York. "Highwaymen," she said, not asking. "On the Kirkby Road, 3 of them." He was quiet a moment. "I was traveling as a guardsman, escort duty out of Newcastle. My horse bolted after the first blow. I walked until I could not walk any further." The story came out flat and even, the way a rehearsed thing came out. Mina lifted the coat and did not press him. "I'll mend this for you. The tear will not show once it's done." "You needn't. It is what I do, sir." She carried the coat to her work table and set to it. Her needle moved in small, careful stitches, drawing the wool back together as though it had never parted. She kept her head bent. She did not look at him, but she felt his eyes on her hands, and on the plain gray stuff of her sleeves, and on the neat, patched cuff of her own gown. An hour passed in that quiet. The fog thinned at the windows. A milk cart clattered somewhere down the lane. "Miss Whitcomb." She looked up. He had eased himself into a sitting posture against the hearthstones, the quilt pulled about his shoulders. "You gave me your bread last night. I gave you half of it. There was none left for you this morning." I saw the shelf. Mina's needle paused. She had thought him still asleep when she had checked the muslin at first light and found only crumbs. "There will be more by evening. Mrs. Halliday at the bakery owes me for a mended pinafore." "That is not an answer." "It is the answer I have, sir." He was quiet for a long while after that. She thought perhaps he had drifted off again, and she went back to her stitching. But when she next glanced up, he was still watching her, and his face had changed. Something had come into it that had not been there before. Not pity. She would have known pity and refused it. This was something quieter, and it made her uneasy in a way she could not name. "You do not know me," he said at last. "No, sir, I do not." And yet, she agreed, and set another stitch. She did not tell him that her mother had died 3 days after being turned away from a rich man's door. She did not tell him that her brother Thomas had once said, over a bowl of thin porridge, that the world only became worse when the kind grew tired of being kind. She did not tell him that she had made a small, silent promise then, at 14 years old, that she would not be the one to prove Thomas right. She only sewed. Lucas watched her a moment longer, then closed his eyes and let his head rest against the warm stones of the hearth. His hand, resting on the quilt, was still curled loosely, as though it remembered the shape of the bread she had pressed into it the night before. By the third morning, Lucas could stand. He did so slowly, one hand braced against the mantel, and Mina looked up from her work in time to see him sway. She was on her feet at once, but he waved her back with a small, dry smile. "I have had worse mornings, Miss Whitcomb. In worse company. You have not eaten enough to stand." "I have eaten more than my share of what you have." She did not answer that. It had been true 2 days ago. It had been true yesterday. This morning she had walked to Mrs. Halliday's back door before the sun was up, and come away with a small loaf, a twist of tea, and a rasher of streaky bacon, all wrapped in brown paper. The pinafore had been worth more than that. But Mrs. Halliday had a hard year behind her too, and Mina had not the heart to press. Lucas eased himself back to the settle by the hearth. Mina had dragged the old thing out of the storage room the previous evening, muttering about her back the whole while. He had tried to help. She had shooed him off with the flat of her hand and a look that brooked no argument. Now he sat there in his shirt sleeves, the linen loose at the throat, his greatcoat hung to air on the peg by the door. "I ought to have that back today," he said, glancing at it. "If I am to be on my way tomorrow." "You are not on your way tomorrow, Miss Whitcomb, sir." He almost laughed. He caught it before it fully came out, and it turned into a cough. Mina brought him water without a word. When he had drunk, she took the cup back and looked at the coat on its peg. It wanted a proper cleaning. The wool had drawn in the damp of the fog and the road, and there was a dark stain along the shoulder that would set into the fibers if she left it another day. "I'll see to it now," she said. "The wool will not forgive me if I wait." He nodded and let his head rest back against the settle. Mina lifted the coat down. It was heavier than she remembered, though perhaps that was only because her arms were tired. She carried it into the small storage room at the back of the shop, where she kept her wash tub and a low table for such work. She lit the lamp. The room smelled of lavender and old cedar. She spread the coat across the table and set to it methodically, brushing down the wool with a stiff bristle, working from the collar to the hem. Dust rose in a fine cloud and settled on her sleeves. She checked the pockets. That was habit. Her father had taught her, years ago, to always check a gentleman's pockets before laundering, for coins and letters and pipe tobacco that might spoil a good coat. She slid her fingers into the outer pocket first. Empty. The inner breast pocket held only a folded square of oilcloth, blank on both sides. The small pocket sewn into the lining, near the ribs, held something hard. She drew it out. It was a ring, heavy, warm from the coat, gold, and old gold at that, the sort that had a red cast to it. The face of the ring bore a seal, deeply cut, and Mina turned it towards the lamp to see it clearly. A tower, quartered with a pair of crossed hunting horns, and beneath, in small worn letters, a motto she had heard once and never forgotten: Ferro et fide, by iron and by faith. Her hand went cold. The ring was cold now too, though it had not been a moment before. She sat down slowly on the edge of the low table, and she stared at it, as though it might change into some other thing if she looked long enough. She knew that crest. She had seen it on a paper once, folded and sealed, and pressed into her mother's hand by a magistrate's clerk on a wet afternoon in October. Her mother had opened it there in the street, and Mina had watched her face go the color of the paper itself. Thomas had been named upon it. Thomas, who at 17 had done nothing worse than run errands for a cloth merchant with a crooked ledger. Thomas, who had been marched out of the county before the leaves had fallen and had never been heard from since. The seal on that paper had been this seal. The name at the bottom had been the Duke of Ravenshold. The Iron Duke, they called him in the papers. Lucan, the stern hand of the North. Mina closed her fingers around the ring until the edges of the seal bit into her palm. She sat very still. She thought of the man in the next room, his long hands, his slow, watchful eyes, the way he had said her name, as though it were something worth being said carefully. The pale line on his smallest finger, where a ring had been. Not Lucas, never Lucas, Lucan. A sound came up out of her chest that was neither a sob nor a laugh, and she pressed the back of her wrist against her mouth to keep it in. Her mother had died with Thomas's name on her lips. Her father had gone into a decline the winter after and had not come out of it. Mina had buried them both in the same small plot beyond the churchyard wall, and she had learned to sew for a widow's rate and a spinster's supper, and all of it, had begun with a seal pressed into red wax. The man on her settle had signed that wax. For one wild moment she thought of the cold outside, the fog, the road. How easy it would be to gather his coat and his boots and set them upon the step, to draw the bolt, to let the night have him back. She rose. Her legs shook. She stood in the doorway between the storage room and the shop, and she looked at him. His eyes were closed. His breathing was easy. He looked, for the first time since she had dragged him in from the fog, like a man at rest. The ring lay heavy in her fist. She did not know how long she stood there. Mina did not sleep that night, nor the one after. She kept the ring in a small tin behind the loose brick in the storage room, the same hiding place her father had once used for the shop's takings. She could not bear to have it upon her person. She could not bear, either, to give it back. Lucas mended in the meanwhile. He walked the length of the shop by the fourth morning, one hand along the wall, and by the fifth he could sit at her work table without gripping the edge. He asked after her work. He watched her sew. He asked whether she had learned the trade from her father, and she said she had, and she did not offer more. He noticed the change in her. She saw him notice. But he did not press, and something in that restraint made her angrier still, though she could not have said why. On the fifth day, she needed thread. She had put it off as long as she could. Her stock of black silk was down to a few yards, and she had a morning waistcoat promised to the curate's brother by Saturday. She wrapped her shawl about her shoulders, tied her bonnet under her chin, and told Lucas she would return before noon. "Miss Whitcomb!" She paused with her hand on the latch. "Take care upon the road." She did not turn. "I always do, sir." The fog had thinned to a soft gray haze by the time she reached the top of the high street. Weatherby on Ings was waking in its slow, ordinary fashion. A butcher's boy swept the step outside his master's shop. Two washerwomen carried baskets between them. The tinker had set up his little cart at the corner and was calling out for knives to sharpen. Then Mina turned into the market square and stopped short. The square was full of horses, not the ambling farm horses of a market day, but tall, dark hunters with hides brushed to a shine. Men stood beside them in long riding coats of deep blue wool, sword hilts at their hips, and each coat bore a small silver pin at the collar. Mina knew the shape of that pin without needing to draw closer. A tower, crossed horns. There were perhaps a dozen of them, working the square in pairs. One pair went into the Rose and Crown. Another rapped upon the door of the coaching inn across the way. A third stood in conversation with the constable, who was nodding rapidly and pointing down the road towards Kirkby. Mina drew her shawl higher and kept her head down. She meant to slip along the edge of the square towards the mercer's, but a hand caught her elbow, and she nearly cried out, "Steady, Miss Whitcomb." It was only Mrs. Halliday, red-faced from the walk up from the bakery. The baker's wife leaned close, her voice pitched low beneath her bonnet brim. "Have you seen? Have you heard? I've only just come. They came before dawn. Ducal men, all the way from the north. They say the Duke himself has been lost off the Kirkby Road these 6 days, and there's not a soul north of the moors dares sleep until he's found." Mina kept her face very still. "The Duke! Ravenshold, girl, the Iron Duke himself, riding under another name, so they say, on some errand of his own." Mrs. Halliday's eyes were bright with the pleasure of a story told first. "And that is not the worst of it. There's a second lot in town, and they are not the Duke's men at all." "A second lot? Look for yourself, by the water pump." Mina let her gaze drift. 3 men stood by the pump, quite apart from the ducal riders. They wore no livery. Their coats were rougher, their boots worn. One had a long knife at his belt in place of a sword, and another had the kind of face that had been broken and set more than once. They were watching the ducal men with the flat, patient look of dogs waiting for a hare to break cover. "Mercenaries," Mrs. Halliday whispered. "Come down from Leeds, so my Tom heard. There's a price on the Duke's head from some quarter or another, and these fellows mean to collect it before the Duke's own men do." She shook her head. "Kirkby is not safe. Weatherby is not safe. There will be blood spilled before the week is out. Mark me." Mina murmured something. She could not afterwards remember what it was. She bought her thread. She did it in a daze, counting out her coppers on the mercer's counter with fingers she could not quite feel. And she took the wrapped packet and walked out of the square by the back way, along the alley behind the smithy, so that she would not have to pass the men at the pump. She did not go straight home. She stopped at the low stone wall behind the churchyard, where the graves of her mother and father lay beneath a rowan tree, and she stood there a long while, with the packet of black silk held tight against her chest. She thought of Thomas. She thought of the man on her settle, whose fever had broken only 2 nights ago, and who could not have walked half a mile without falling. She thought of the mercenary by the pump, and the knife at his belt, and what such men did when they had cornered a prize. A wren flitted along the wall and vanished into the yew. Mina drew a breath. It hurt, somewhere beneath her ribs, in a place she had thought she had closed off long ago. She turned and walked home, and by the time she reached her own door, she had made her choice, though she did not yet know what it would cost her. 2 nights passed after Mina came back from the market, and in that time, she did not once look Lucas full in the face. She fed him. She changed the dressing at his temple. She set his mended coat on the peg where he could see it, but she did it with her eyes low, and her answers had gone short, and by the second evening he had ceased trying to draw her out. She had moved him to the attic on the 7th night. It was safer there. The attic ran the length of the shop above the workroom, with a slanted timber ceiling and a small round window that looked out over the roofs of the lane. She had dragged a straw pallet up the narrow stair and made him a bed of it, with the quilt from the settle and a bolster of folded wool. If the ducal riders came knocking, or the men from the water pump, she could deny that any traveler had ever passed her door, and there would be nothing in the workroom below to say otherwise. Lucas had climbed the stairs slowly, one hand on the wall. He had not asked why. She thought perhaps he already knew. That night, when the shop was locked and the single tallow candle guttered on the little upturned crate beside the pallet, Mina climbed the stair with the tin in her hand. He was awake. He was sitting up against the sloped beam of the roof, his shirt open at the throat, the quilt drawn to his waist. The candle caught one side of his face and left the other in shadow, and his eyes moved to the tin the moment her head cleared the stairwell. Mina sat down on the low stool she had carried up the day before. She set the tin on the floor between them and lifted the lid. The ring lay on a scrap of muslin. In the candlelight, the gold looked almost red. Neither of them spoke. Mina watched his face. She had thought, in the small hours of the past 2 nights, that she wanted to see him startle. She wanted to see the mask drop. She wanted him to lie, so that she might hate him cleanly for it. He did none of those things. His eyes rested on the ring a long moment, and then they rose to hers, and he simply waited. My brother's name was Thomas Whitcomb. Her voice came out lower than she had meant. She steadied it. He was 17 years of age. He ran errands for a cloth merchant by the name of Bagley, on the road between here and Ripon. In the October of the year 1832, a magistrate's clerk came to our door with a paper folded in 3, and the seal on that paper was your seal, and the name at the bottom was your name. She paused. Her hands had begun to tremble. She folded them tight in her lap. Thomas was put upon a cart the next morning. He was sent out of the county under an exile order. My mother followed the cart to the end of the lane. She fell in the road there. She did not walk properly again. She was buried the following March, and my father the winter after. We have had no word of Thomas from that day to this. The candle spat. A little of the wax ran down the side. You signed that paper, sir. Lucas said nothing for a long moment. He looked at the ring, and then at her, and then at his own hands, which lay open on the quilt. I signed it. You do not deny it. I would not insult you by denying it. Mina had thought she would weep. She did not. Something inside her had gone very still and very cold, and it was steadier than tears. "You came into my house," she said. "You ate my bread. You let me sit up with you. You let me stitch your coat with my own hands, and all the while you knew whose door you had fallen against. I did not know your name until you gave it to me. You knew this town. You knew this county. I knew them both. Then say it, sir. Say what you did." He drew a slow breath. He seemed, in that candlelight, older than he had a moment before. "I signed a great many papers in that October, Miss Whitcomb. I signed them from a chair in Newcastle, upon the word of magistrates I had cause to trust. The name Thomas Whitcomb was one of 11 upon the sheet I was given that morning. I did not read the particulars of a single case. That is the plain truth of it, and it is no defense, and I offer it as none." Mina's throat had closed. "You will not tell me you are sorry. I will not insult you with that either. Then what will you tell me?" Lucas looked at her a long while. "That the ring is yours to do with as you please," he said quietly. "You may put it in the fire. You may set it upon the step and call the men at the pump to come and take me. You may turn the key on this attic and walk down the stair, and I will not lift a hand to stop you. I have no claim upon your kindness. I never had." The candle guttered. A thin line of smoke rose from it. Mina stared at him. She had come up the stair with a speech ready in her mouth, and he had unmade it with 3 sentences, and the worst of it was that she believed him. She reached down. She closed the lid of the tin. She stood, and she took the tin with her, and she left him there in the dark, without another word. At the foot of the stair she stopped, and she pressed her forehead against the wall, and she stayed that way a long time. She did not turn him out. She did not sleep either. But by the gray of the 10th morning her mind was made up, and it had been made up, she thought, from the moment she had leaned her forehead against the wall at the foot of the attic stair. Mina climbed up with a bundle in her arms. Lucas was already awake, dressed in the shirt and breeches she had washed for him, his boots pulled on. He looked at the bundle in her hands and then at her face, and whatever he read there caused him to rise without a word. "There is a track," she said. "It runs behind the churchyard, up along the beck, and it comes out on the old drover's road above Ingle Fell. My father used it when he went to buy fleece from the hill farms. It has not been used in some years. The mercenaries will not know of it. Your own men will not know of it either, which is the price of the safety. How far to the northern bridge? 2 days if the weather holds, 3 if it does not." He inclined his head. "I will owe you a debt I cannot pay, Miss Whitcomb." "You will owe me nothing, sir. I am not doing this for you." She said it plainly, and he did not press her upon it. They left before the sun was properly up. Mina had rolled a spare shirt and a wedge of hard cheese and half a loaf into an oiled canvas, and she carried it slung across her back. Lucas wore his greatcoat with the collar high and a broad-brimmed laborer's hat she had fetched from the shop's cupboard. In it he looked, from any distance, like a drover down on his luck, which was the point. The lane behind the churchyard was empty. A cart track wound up between 2 dry stone walls, past the last of the cottages, and lost itself in the bracken beyond. Mina led. Lucas walked behind her. Neither of them spoke until the roofs of Wetherby were out of sight below them. By noon, they were on the open fell. The wind was cold. The sky had that white, hollow look that meant snow before nightfall if the temperature dropped. Mina walked with her shawl drawn tight, and her eyes upon the path. The old track was faint here, only a darker line through the winter grass, and she had to slow now and again to find it. Lucas kept up. He was pale by the 2nd hour, and she saw the way his hand went now and again to his side, but he did not ask her to stop, and she did not offer. They rested at a shepherd's stone hut on the shoulder of the fell. The roof was half gone, the hearth was cold. Mina broke off a piece of the cheese and gave it to him, and she took a smaller piece for herself, and they ate sitting on the low stones without looking at each other. He spoke first. "Your brother." Mina did not answer. "May I say a thing to you, Miss Whitcomb?" "You may say what you like, sir. I cannot promise to listen." He accepted that. He looked out through the broken doorway at the grey fell. "After I was carried back to Newcastle the following spring, a clerk of mine came to me with a matter he had been troubled by. There had been a merchant on the Ripon Road, Bagley. The name was already known to me by then, though for other reasons. He had run a scheme of false receipts for near 4 years, and he had let it fall upon a lad who kept his ledger for him. The lad had put his mark to papers he had not understood. Mina's hands had gone still upon the bundle in her lap. When the matter came before me for a second review, I did what could be done. The exile stood, because the seal had been set, and the record could not be unset without a public hearing, which would have cost the lad more than it saved him. But the sentence was quietly commuted. He was not sent to the hulks, as had been ordered. He was sent to a wool merchant of my acquaintance in Northumberland who owed me a favor, and he was given honest work and a lodging. Mina was staring at him. A stipend has been sent to a house in Wetherby-on-Ings every quarter since the March of '33. It was sent under the name of a Ripon charity, so that the family should not refuse it out of pride. It was not much. It was what could be done without making a noise that would have drawn Bagley's notice, for the man had friends in places that took some years to root out. "My mother," Mina said. Her voice had gone hoarse. "My mother was in her grave by the March of '33. Lucas closed his eyes for a moment. "Then the stipend was sent to the house, and the house had none to receive it, and I did not know." She could not speak. He looked at her then. The wind pulled at his hair. "I am not asking you to believe me, upon my word alone, Miss Whitcomb. There are papers, there are ledgers. When we reach my captain's, you shall see every one of them, and if a single word I have said proves false, you may take my ring and my name with it." Mina turned her face away. She did not want him to see it. The wind moved through the broken roof above them. After a long while she stood. She shouldered the bundle. She did not look at him. "We should go on," she said. "There is snow coming." He rose. He followed her out into the wind. They walked until the light failed. They came down off the fell on the morning of the 12th day. The snow had come in the night, as Mina had feared, though it had held off long enough for them to reach a stone bothy above Inglebeck. They had sat out the worst of it there, wrapped in the quilt she had thought to bring, with a small fire of peat that Lucas had coaxed out of a damp stack in the corner. Neither of them had slept much. Neither of them had spoken much either. What had been said upon the fell the day before sat between them like a third traveler, and it wanted no company. By dawn, the wind had dropped. The snow lay thin upon the heather, no more than a dusting, and beyond the last shoulder of the hill, Mina could see the pale gray ribbon of the northern road running east and west along the valley floor. Lucas stopped at the crest and stood a long moment. "There," he said. She followed his eye. A little way off the road, at the head of a stone bridge, sat a low huddle of tents and picketed horses. A gray banner hung from a lance at the center of the camp. Even at this distance, Mina could see the tower and the horns upon it. She did not move. "Miss Whitcomb." "I am coming, sir." She came. They walked the last mile in silence. Halfway down the slope, a rider broke from the camp and came up the track at a hard canter. He was a young man, no more than 25, with a fair mustache and a heavy gray riding cloak. He drew rein 20 paces short of them, and his face went the color of old milk. "Your Grace? Captain Ellsworth. We had feared you dead these 10 days. I very nearly was. This lady is the reason I am not. You will remember that." The captain looked at Mina. Whatever he had expected to find beside the Duke of Ravenshold upon a Cumberland fell, It had not been a slight seamstress in a slate-blue gown, with the hem gone black from a 2-day walk. He recovered quickly. He swung down from his horse, and he took his hat off, and he inclined his head to her with the gravity he had, a moment before, given to his master. "Ma'am?" Mina did not know what to do with it. She dropped a small, awkward curtsy and let it pass. The camp came alive as they walked into it. Men rose from cook fires. A gray-haired officer with a scar down his cheek came out of the largest tent and stopped short at the sight of Lucas, and his mouth opened, and he shut it again without speaking. Mina watched a hardened man of perhaps 50 years lay his hand flat upon his chest and bow his head, and she understood then, more than she had understood on the fell or in the attic, what manner of man had been sitting on her settle in his shirt-sleeves. Lucas turned to her. "Miss Whitcomb, this is Colonel Hartwood." "Colonel, Miss Whitcomb is my guest. She is to be given the small tent that was to have been mine. She is to have hot water, dry clothing, and whatever food she asks for. She is to be attended by no one she has not first agreed to see. Is that plain?" "Perfectly plain, Your Grace. She is not a servant of this camp. She is not a subject of any question. She has walked 2 days through a snow to bring me here. You will remember that also." "I shall, Your Grace." Mina stood in the middle of it, with her bundle still upon her back and her cheeks burning. She had not been spoken of in such terms in all her life. She wanted, very much, to say that she needed none of it, that she would take her cheese rind and her canvas bundle and start the walk home before the light failed. But her legs had begun to shake beneath her gown, and she had not eaten since the night before, and pride was a poor thing to stand upon when the body would not answer. She let herself be led to the tent. It was small, canvas over a timber frame, with a folding cot and a brazier already lit. A young orderly brought a copper basin of hot water and a folded blanket and a plain wool gown of dark green that had, he explained with a duck of his head, belonged to the colonel's daughter and had been in the baggage against the cold. Mina thanked him. He went out. She sat down upon the edge of the cot, and for a long while she did nothing at all. When she came out again, an hour later, in the green gown and with her hair combed and pinned afresh, she found Lucas by the largest tent in conversation with 3 officers. He looked up at once. He came to her. He was a different man in this place. She had known he would be. His coat had been brushed. His shirt was clean. He wore a sword at his hip that he had not worn in her workroom, and he stood as a man stood who was accustomed to being answered the moment he spoke. But his eyes upon her, when he came near, were the same eyes that had watched her stitch a shoulder seam by a low fire. "Miss Whitcomb, are you cared for?" "I am cared for, sir, more than I know what to do with." He allowed himself a small, tired smile. "I have set 2 of my captains to a task. They are to ride south this afternoon and to bring up from the archives at Newcastle every paper that bears the name of Thomas Whitcomb, every one. You shall read them yourself. Upon my word." She looked at him a long moment. "Thank you, sir," she said quietly. It was the first easy thing she had said to him since the 3rd night. The road south took 4 days. They traveled in a plain closed carriage with the ducal arms covered over, and an escort of 6 riders who kept a courteous distance ahead and behind. Mina sat with a woolen rug across her knees and watched the country change through the small square window. The bare fells gave way to gentler hills, then to hedge-rowed fields with rooks in the ploughland, and by the 4th afternoon they were clattering under the stone arch of the gatehouse at Ravenshold. The estate lay in a fold of the land, sheltered by beech woods on 3 sides. The house was old, gray stone weathered to a soft dove color, with tall mullioned windows and a slate roof that had settled with the centuries. Mina had not known what she expected. She had expected a fortress, perhaps. She had not expected the small, careful garden of clipped box that ran along the front, nor the 2 liver and white spaniels that came bounding out to meet the carriage. A housekeeper in a black bombazine gown and a starched white cap curtsied them in. Her name was Mrs. Penrose. She had a face like a walnut and eyes that missed nothing, and she took Mina under her wing without a fuss, as though guests arrived in green gowns 2 sizes too large upon her doorstep every day of the week. Mina was given a room that looked out upon the beech woods. She was given, also, a plain gown of soft brown merino that fit her properly, and a shawl of gray wool with a fringe, and hot chocolate in a china cup upon a tray. She sat upon the edge of a poster bed and stared at the tray for some time before she could bring herself to touch it. The papers came the next morning. A footman knocked and led her along a broad paneled corridor to a room at the west end of the house. It was long and low, with 2 tall windows and shelves of ledgers running from floor to ceiling on every wall. A long oak table stood in the center, and upon it, in 3 neat piles bound with red tape, lay the archive that had been fetched up from Newcastle. Lucas was there. He was dressed plainly, dark coat, dark waistcoat, no sword, and he had the look of a man who had slept little. Colonel Hartwood stood by the window with his hands behind his back. A clerk in spectacles sat at the end of the table with a pen and an open ledger. Miss Whitcomb. Lucas drew out a chair for her himself. She sat. These are every document that bears your brother's name. They have been fetched under seal and opened only in this room. You are to read them at your own pace. Nothing shall be kept from you. Mr. Ferris here will find any paper you ask for. Colonel Hartwood and I shall remain, or shall withdraw, as you prefer. Remain, sir. She said it before she had thought it through. She wanted witnesses. She wanted, if any of it broke her, to have it break in front of the man who had signed the paper that started it. She untied the first bundle. The order of exile was on the top. She had thought she remembered it, but seeing it again, the seal cracked in 3 places, the ink faded, brought back a morning she had thought safely buried. She read it through. Then she set it aside. Beneath it was a review sheet, dated the following March. The particulars of Bagley's scheme were set out in a neat clerk's hand. 14 counts of false receipt. 3 witnesses. A margin note in a different hand, a sharper hand, read Whitcomb lad, no willful part. Kept the ledger under duress. Verify. She looked up. Lucas met her eyes and looked away. Below the review sheet was the commutation. A single page, briefly worded, signed and sealed. Below that, a letter of introduction to a Mr. Ainsworth, wool merchant of Alnwick, requesting a place in his warehouse for a young man of good hand and honest disposition. Below that, a receipt from Mr. Ainsworth, dated the June of the same year, confirming that the young man had arrived and had been set to work. Mina read on. There were letters, not many, but enough. A short note in her brother's own hand, thanking a Mr. Ainsworth for the loan of a coat. A longer letter, dated 1837, in which Thomas wrote of his marriage to a girl called Alice, daughter of a draper in Morpeth. A christening record from the parish of St. Cuthbert's, Alnwick, dated the spring of 1839, for one Margaret Whitcomb, daughter of Thomas and Alice Whitcomb of that parish. Mina put her hand over her mouth. She read on, because she could not stop. There were the stipend receipts. Quarterly, from the March of 33, made out to the household of Whitcomb, Weatherby on Ings, care of a Ripon almoner. Each one had, in a later hand, the notation undelivered, no household, and the money returned to the estate. 16 years of quarterly returns, every one of them recorded, every one of them signed off. The last paper in the third bundle was a letter dated only 2 months past. It was from Thomas. He had heard, through Mr. Ainsworth, of inquiries being made at Alnwick, regarding his family in Wetherby. He wrote that he had believed, all these years, that his mother and sister had abandoned him after the shame of the exile. He wrote that he had not dared to write to them himself, for fear of bringing the name upon them a second time. He wrote that if there were any word of them, any word at all, he would be grateful beyond the measure of it. Mina laid the letter flat upon the table. Her hands were shaking. She could not have said whether it was grief or something else. Lucas rose. He did not come near her. He only stood, and he waited. And when she at last looked up at him, her cheeks were wet, and she was smiling in a broken way, and she could not speak at all. He inclined his head to her. "He is a 2 days' ride from here," he said quietly. "When you are ready." She rode north within the week. Lucas did not go with her. He had understood, without her having to say it, that this first meeting was not one for a duke to stand witness to. He sent only Colonel Hartwood, who had a sister in Alnwick, and a plain traveling coat, and a letter of introduction that Mina carried folded in the pocket of her gown. The wool merchant's house stood on a quiet lane behind the parish church. It had a green door and a boot scraper in the shape of a hedgehog. Mina stood upon the step for a full minute before she could bring herself to knock. The girl who opened the door was perhaps 11 years of age, with chestnut hair parted in the center and a serious little mouth. She looked up at Mina, and her mouth opened, and she said, without being told, "You are my aunt." Mina could not speak. Thomas came into the hall. He was broader than she remembered. He had a beard now, close cropped, and there was gray in it at the chin. He stopped short in the doorway of his own parlor, and his face went through half a dozen things at once, and then he came the length of the hall in 3 strides, and put his arms about her, and he did not let go for a long while. She stayed 4 days. She met Alice, who was small and soft-spoken, and pressed a cup of tea into her hand within a minute of her sitting down. She met Margaret properly, who wanted to know at once whether her aunt could truly cut a gown from a single length of cloth without a pattern, and would she teach her? She sat by their fire in the evenings, and she told them what had happened to their mother, and to their father, and to the shop in Wetherby, and she wept when she needed to, and Thomas wept too, and it was the first honest weeping she had done in 16 years. On the 4th evening, Thomas walked her along the river. "You will not go back to Wetherby," he said. "It was not a question. I have not decided. You have." She looked at him. He had their mother's smile when he chose to use it. "The Duke has offered me a post," she said. "Head textile designer to the Northern Trade Guild. A workshop of my own. Girls to train if I wish it. He has been at pains to say that no answer is expected soon, and that no answer at all is a perfectly acceptable answer, and that if I would prefer a small annuity and a cottage of my own, that is his to give also." Thomas walked a while in silence. "And what does Mina Whitcomb say?" "Mina Whitcomb," she said slowly, "has been sewing morning waistcoats by candlelight for 6 winters. Mina Whitcomb has forgotten what she can do when she is not afraid. Then she has her answer." She smiled at the river. "I believe she has. She came south again, in the last week of the month." The workshop was made ready for her by the spring. It stood in a converted almshouse on the edge of a market town, 3 miles from Ravenshold, with tall north-facing windows for the light, and a long cutting table down the center, and 8 small pallets in the upper story for the girls who would come and go. Lucas had asked only what she wanted. He had provided it without a flourish, and he had signed the deed of the almshouse over to her name, so that no man after him could take it away. She took in 7 girls in the first year. They were the sort of girls the parish had given up upon. 2 came from a workhouse in Leeds. 1 had walked out of a bad service in York, with no character to speak of. 1 was the deaf daughter of a Northumbrian ploughman. Mina taught them the trade her father had taught her, and she paid them a wage, and she housed them, and she made no promises she could not keep. She saw Lucas often, though not, at first, as anything other than the patron of the workshop. He would ride over on a Thursday, in a plain coat and without escort, and he would sit at her cutting table and drink tea from a chipped cup that the girls kept for him upon a particular shelf. He would ask after their progress. He would ask after her own health. He would leave before dark, and he would take with him whatever letters she had for Thomas at Alnwick, for he had a rider who went that way each week. It was a slow thing between them. It was, she came to understand, meant to be a slow thing. He had signed a paper once without reading it, and he had made a vow to himself, upon a Cumberland fell, that he would not be that man again. He carried the vow into every corner of his life. He carried it into the great hall of Ravenshold, where he was known within the year for hearing every particular of every case that came before him, however small, and for keeping a clerk at his elbow who was instructed to interrupt him if he ever looked to be signing without reading. He carried it also into the small parlor of the almshouse workshop, where he sat one evening in the autumn of the following year, and he asked Mina, without preamble and without ceremony, whether she might in time consider being his wife. She did not answer him for a full month. When she did, she answered yes. The wedding was quiet. Thomas gave her away. Margaret carried the flowers. Mrs. Penrose wept into a starched handkerchief and denied afterwards that she had done so. Above the door of the workshop, Mina had a small wooden sign hung. It was painted plainly, in her father's old hand, which she had copied from a receipt she had kept. Whitcomb and daughter. She never took it down.